Well, okay, we have 1 p.m. Thank you, everyone, for attending our webinar today. Today, we're going to focus on a developer topic in Power BI Embedded. I've tried to be funny with the subtitle. Reports of my death are greatly exaggerated, of course, by the famous Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain. And the parallel to Power BI is that they had a Power BI embedded service that was retired, and then they created yet a new one with the same name. So we're going to kind of look into all the details of that. Okay, so over the next hour, we're going to look at lots of different things. Note that I'm going to show some PowerPoint slides and about 3 different Visual Studio sample projects. And so if you go track down this URL that we have right here, let me go ahead and open this up just to kind of show you what we have inside there. Okay, any second now PowerPoint should redirect this, or maybe I'll just go there myself. Okay, so note that in this URL right here, and I'll go ahead and I'll put this in the chat window, just kind of making it easy for everybody to be able to find that. You know, what you'll find is there are slides, both the PDF and the PPTX. Notice if you click on the PDF version of the slides, GitHub has a cool server-side rendering, so you can see them right inside here. It's taking just a second, but there are all the slides that we're going to be looking at. And then also note, if you drill down just a little bit into demos, here are the different Visual Studio projects that I'm going to be showing over this webinar. Okay, now we're going to start just with some fundamentals of Power BI embedding. We also have to talk about dedicated capacities, and to some degree, this is going to be a general talk about Power BI embedding, but it's going to focus on how we do it using the new Power BI embedded service in Azure. So we can also use Power BI Premium, another way to accomplish the same goal. But here, because the embedding story in Azure is newer, that's the one I think probably most of you are, still trying to pull all the details together. Okay, just a little bit of background. Anyone who's coming to this webinar, I'm guessing, has already invested in Power BI, kind of knows about the Power BI service. And the idea is that it's accessible with the browser through app.powerbi.com. It's also where users go when they use the Power BI mobile apps. It connects in through app.powerbi.com. And for us developers, we don't like to do things like users do. We like to be developers, so we want to program against Power BI. And so there's a Power BI Service API that we're going to be looking at. Now, the Power BI Service API goes by different names. At first, it was called the Power BI REST API. Many people still call it that. Some people call it the Power BI API. But when you go up into Azure and you configure permissions, it's called the Power BI Service API. So that's the name I'm going to stick with. And I don't call it the Power BI REST API as much anymore because you can access it via REST. You can also access it via the Power BI SDK, which puts a friendly little .NET assembly around it. Okay, so once again, using the Power BI Service API, you can make direct REST calls against it. You can use the assembly DLL that abstracts away the REST calls. And if you have used this DLL, what you'll find is it's growing, but it's not growing as fast, and it doesn't cover everything that the raw REST API calls. So we're kind of playing this game where we use the assembly to do what it can do, and then for things it can't do, we fall back and make REST calls directly. So it's kind of a imperfect world, but that is the way things are working, and you'll see some examples of that as we go through the session. Okay, now when you talk to the Power BI Service API, if you've never done this before, you have to talk to Azure Active Directory and authenticate the current user and start juggling access tokens and something that's specific to Power BI, which are called embed tokens. And we're going to see both of those, as we go through this particular session. Now, what was Power BI Embedded? Power BI Embedded is a service. I guess it's kind of still there a little bit. If I go over and I go back into Power BI, I'm going to go into Azure. And with my particular Azure subscription, let's go ahead and authenticate against Azure right here. And once I get into Azure, you're going to see that Power BI Workspace Collections is the thing that we had earlier. Note that if you had created a service based on the old model, you can still use it, and they're kind of retiring that over time. If I now go down and I try to create a Power BI Workspace collection, what you're going to see is that they're going to tell you this service is deprecated, and that what you should be creating, is the new Power BI embedded service inside there. Once again, I try to create Power BI embedded using the old service, and it kind of points me to the new service inside there. Now, here's an example of customer pool 01 and customer pool 02. So let's say that I want to create a new Power BI embedded service. So I'm going to go ahead and call new inside here. One of the neat things about the Power BI embedded service is that when you create it, you can stop it. So let's go ahead and call this, I have customer pool 01, customer pool 2. I'm going to create a new one. Let's go ahead and put this into an existing resource group. Now that I've done that, what is my location? Note that if you've used Azure and you've created web apps and you've created things like virtual machines, you probably didn't have to worry about synchronizing your subscription and the things you were creating in the same directory. However, with Power BI, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to be creating things that have to be in the same directory, which then says wherever your subscription is and the directory that holds your Power BI infrastructure. If that's in East US, well, then the service you create, has to be in the same thing. Okay, now there's also price tiering inside here. So let's go ahead and pick one of these particular price tiers, and we'll go ahead and choose create. And now it's going to take a couple seconds to spin this up. Now, what you'll see is that I can set different sizes inside there. Now, the old Power BI embedded service, like the new one, was a service provisioned on demand. It was provisioned in terms of workspace collections. So if you ever heard the term workspace collection, that's deprecated. That's the old infrastructure. And the pricing model that they had was based on the number of report sessions. Okay, now Power BI embedded was sunsetted. It's a hard verb, sunsetted, beginning in May. So they didn't close it down, but they told customers that were already using it, we're going to give you 18 months before we retire the service. And back when they retired it, my feeling was they didn't think they were going to do anything else in Azure. They thought they were moving everything over to Office 365. And so what happened is lots of developers and ISVs started pushing back saying, you gave us some goodness in the sense that I could create something in Azure as an on-demand service. So one good point about the new service is that eliminates the need for the users that you're reaching to have Power BI licenses, or Azure Active Directory accounts. So it opens up Power BI to, true commercial platforms. For instance, I have a application and I have lots of different customers, and each customer has an account, but those accounts are just stored in something like a SQL database because I'm using forms-based authentication. So there's no way I can really tie my user authentication system, into Power BI. So when I use Power BI embedded, Power BI knows nothing about my users, and it's able to serve up reports, to users that are unknown and completely unlicensed, which is required for, many commercial style applications. Okay, now how does it improve upon what we had in Power BI embedded v1? Okay, so we're created on demand as a service using an Azure subscription, so that's the same, but now the service can be scaled up, scaled down, or stopped. Let's go back for a second, and I should see that if I do a quick refresh here, well, now there's my premium customer pool. Let's go ahead and open that up. So unlike using Power BI Premium, if I don't want to use this, especially if I'm a developer, I can just stop the service. I don't have to create something that runs around the clock. So here is the pause button. Also note on the pricing tier, let's go up here. You can kind of see the price of the individual price points. The A1, which is kind of the bottom line, starts at about $1 per hour, which comes out to about $750 per month. Let's say that I want to scale up a little bit. So I'll go to an A2. $1,500 a month, that's expensive, but it's about $2 an hour or so. And as you keep going up, note that A1 and A2 are shared, so you don't get the entire set of resources just to yourself, but there's other customers, who have Azure services, that are commingling with you. Okay, so let's say that I go ahead and I scale this one up. Okay, so once again, you can scale up by changing the service. I can scale down, I can pause it, I can restart it, and then I can create multiple services. For instance, now I have 3 services, and imagine you have this small pool of premium customers, and you want to make sure that they're all running, in a very fast, responsive environment. And then you have a bigger pool of customers that you aren't so concerned with that you can run, in a less expensive pool. So you're going to be able to mix and match. Okay, another neat thing is, as I'm creating this service, let's go back over here. Let's go back into Power BI. So let me go back to Power BI. Let me go ahead and sign in to Power BI. So what you're going to see here is that when you have a capacity, unlike V1, where you had to kind of do everything with PowerShell, let's now go back and, for instance, I'll go to customer A right here, and inside of this particular workspace right here, let's go down here and edit workspace. And now note that I have these different pools. So the idea is that you just take an app workspace, you put it in your dedicated capacity. I go ahead and hit save, and all of a sudden, all the resources there are now kind of running inside of that workspace. Note that if I come back here to the admin portal, and we go and we look at capacity settings, you're going to see that if you have P SKUs or EM SKUs, which we'll talk about in just a bit, you're going to see things under Power BI Premium. However, if I go under Power BI Embedded, I'll see the different things that I built. I can kind of see the size of the SKU that I'm using inside there. Okay, and once again, these things are easy to scale up or scale down manually like I just did, or through PowerShell, or through REST API calls into Azure. So once again, it's very easy to control these inside there. Okay, now back in the slides, let's look at the big picture of Power BI embedding. And so what we're going to talk about here is true of Power BI embedding, whether we're using Power BI Embedded or Power BI Premium. And the idea is the user is going to connect to your app. And when the user connects to your app, the first thing that you have to do before you can talk to the Power BI service is to interact with Azure. You have to authenticate either the current user or a master user account, depending on your scenario, and get back an access token. Then, once you have the access token, you can call into the Power BI service. So let's say you want to embed a report. So if you're able to call into the Power BI service, you make a call to get back information about the report. What's its GUID that identifies it? What's its embed URL? You also might need to get a special token called a embed token. But the idea is that after you make that call, you push everything out into the client browser. You push all this data that's required for embedding. So then what we're going to do is we're going to use a second API, which is a client-side JavaScript API called the Power BI JavaScript API. And its job is to take the report embedding data and to create an iframe and basically to establish a connection, back to the Power BI service. Now, let's look at a quick sample inside here. For instance, if I now go to, where I've put this application out on the internet, well, I go to this application, and now, here I'm going to load in a report. So I go ahead and click, and note that we have some client-side JavaScript that basically builds an iframe. It basically then sets the embed URL for the report to the iframe, but it also adds some special sauce. It has to inject a security token, either an access token or an embed token inside there. But the idea is that once the report gets embedded, note that this user now can do things like interact with this report inside there. And, we have full interaction. And the key point here is once you create that iframe and you initialize the report, everything else just drops out, and you just have an iframe that's directly connected back to the Power BI service. So every time someone clicks on a slicer and basically sets some filtering, nothing goes through your application. The iframe is directly connected to the Power BI service. Okay, now we have to differentiate between two different types of embedding. There's first-party embedding and third-party embedding. So we're going to start with first-party embedding. So you, as the developer, write code to authenticate the current user, and basically you acquire an Azure access token for that user so the user can call into the Power BI service, or your code can call into the Power BI service with the current user's identity and permissions. Now, that is going to require that the user, if we're going to authenticate as the user has to have a Azure Active Directory account. Think of it as an organizational account or an Office 365 account. And the user is also going to have a Power BI license. Different scenarios might have them use a Power BI free license or a pro license, but first-party embedding means if a user is going to touch Power BI, that user has to be licensed. Now, in addition to first-party embedding, we have third-party embedding. This is the one we're really more interested in because it's the only one that's supported with the Azure Power BI Embedded service. So the app doesn't authenticate as a particular user, but instead the app authenticates using a master user account. Just to give a little history, Power BI Embedded v1 it's like Azure storage in the fact that the application had keys, and you would copy the key into your application code that would allow the application to authenticate. So it authenticated as the app without any user identity. So in the new Power BI, there's no such thing as app level authentication. Everything is a user style authentication. So what you have to do is you have to create a master user account, or you can use your own account. And once we do that, we're not going to take the access token for this master user and use that to embed. So instead, we use embed tokens. So we can get a token, that has a far more limited scope. So for instance, if we use the Azure access token for the master user, we'd basically be passing an access token back to the browser that an attacker could use to do, all kinds of things, pretty much anything that the master user could do. So instead, we're going to generate a embed token. First of all, it only has permission on one thing, a single report or a single dashboard. It also is very scaled down in terms of what it can do. So with third-party embedding, we should always be using embed tokens. Now, what's nice about that is that users don't need any account in Azure, nor do they need Power BI licenses. Okay, and your code has access to whatever the master user account has access to. That sounds great. Now, what are the different scenarios for first party and third party? So for first party, it's organizations, where users have Power BI licenses. Okay, embedding reports in SharePoint and team sites. So two quick examples. Let's say that I go to SharePoint. And so SharePoint has a new web part created with a new SharePoint framework that can live on modern pages. And this lets you embed Power BI reports into SharePoint. Okay, so that's the style of first-party embedding. I didn't have to write the code. Some developer in Microsoft wrote the code, but it's still a type of first-party embedding. Okay, there's also work inside of Teams. Excuse me. Let me go ahead and get into my Teams site here. This is newer. You might not have seen this yet. Let me go ahead, and once I can get beyond this little sign in here and get to my Teams site here, what you're going to see is with Teams, they've now kind of give us a second no-code embedding style. So note that I can embed a Power BI report. So I've already embedded the Power BI report, inside of Teams. But once again, here is a use of, first-party embedding. Okay. Now you kind of seen, how first-party embedding can work. You can develop and create first-party extensions. And you can also use things that other people have developed within Microsoft, like the support for embedding in SharePoint and in Teams. Okay. Now, for third-party embedding, it's the scenarios where your users, you can't assign them Power BI licenses. Applications probably have their own security system that authenticates users, and they, want the flexibility to store the user identities in any type of identity provider, and they don't want to have to go to Azure Active Directory. Okay. So when I want to create a project that's going to use this inside there, and the one project that I'm going to show mainly is what's called the Daily Reporter Pro. Okay, I put this application and published it several months ago. I made a couple changes to it, and notice that this application code is inside of the GitHub repository that this site is based on. But what you're going to see here is that I need to use a couple different packages. If I want to program against Azure and get access tokens, there's the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, ADL. So you can see that my application is going to be using that. And then there is the Power BI API. So the second thing there I just underlined, that is the NuGet package that adds the .NET assembly, what they call the Power BI .NET SDK, around the REST API. Okay, and then also we need the JavaScript API, which is going to be on the client anytime I do Power BI embedding. Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about app workspaces. So we're going to create app workspaces as we deploy custom solutions. So for instance, let's go back here, and I'll go and find this one particular app workspace, sales team. And I have a couple different data sets that we've pushed, inside of this. And we have different reports and dashboards. And once again, if you take a particular workspace and you go into the edit mode inside there, what we should be able to see here is that, do we want to put it in a dedicated capacity? Yes or no inside there. Okay. And then what type of dedicated capacity? It could be something, such as a Power BI premium capacity or an Azure Power BI embedded capacity. Okay, now let's go over to customer A. This is the workspace that I'm using right now in the demo. So if I go into edit workspace and we come down here, you can see that I can take this particular workspace and run it in whatever particular capacity that I want. Okay, now I can move it between one or the other, but the important part here, let me go to this next slide, is that in order to do Power BI embedding, you have to put your app workspace into a dedicated capacity. So if you have a workspace and it's not in a dedicated capacity, it's said to be in the shared capacity. And so then all the rules apply, such as the only users that can touch it, are Power BI Pro users because it's an app workspace. However, once we have dedicated capacities, then we start opening things up to free users, and that is users that have Azure Active Directory accounts and the Power BI free license. We also open it up to unknown users. Okay, now the dedicated capacity acts as a dedicated resource. So here, dedicated capacity only used by a single organization, which is mostly true, unless you get the A1 SKU or the A2 SKU. You saw that was a shared infrastructure, but the Office Azure or the Office premium capacities, are always used by a single organization. I take that back. The P1 SKUs are exclusively used by a single organization. With both the EM and the A SKUs, the very bottom ones are shared. Okay, now I know there's a lot of confusion about the different SKUs that we can have. So there's P SKUs, EM SKUs, and A SKUs. And I just kind of want to run through quickly, what the difference is. So the first thing that Microsoft unveiled, and this is back in May and June when they had all the big announcements, was the P SKUs. And P stands for premium, and they call it the all-in version because it allows for, all Power BI capabilities. So one thing it's used for is that if you have free users and you want to give them access to apps, or you have free users and you want other users to be able to share dashboards with them, that will work fine as long as the content, is added into a app workspace that has been configured to run, in a PSKU dedicated capacity. Okay, now note that PSKUs support first-party embedding and third-party embedding. So anything that you can do with the Azure Embedding service, you can also do with the PSKU as far as reaching users. Of course, you can't stop and start the PSKU. But the other thing about the PSKU is it's also the most expensive starting point. So you can kind of see that it starts at $5,000 a month, and then if you want more power, it goes to 10 and 20 grand. Okay, so after Microsoft introduced the PSKUs, then they introduced the EM SKUs, where EM stood for embedding. Now, this is still controlled by the Office team, not the Azure team. So the capacity is kind of created and managed, on the Office side. And generally, that's used for SaaS applications. So I just showed you how to integrate with SharePoint or Teams. And the idea is that if I have an app workspace, and it's a shared app workspace, it's in a shared capacity, I'm not using any dedicated capacity, only users, that have pro licenses can see what's inside there. So if I put something into a workspace that's associated with a EM SKU capacity, free users can basically get to the content. However, here's the rub. They can't go through PowerBI.com, which means they can't use any of the built-in user interface experience in app.powerbi.com or the mobile apps. So that means either you have to develop a custom solution or use the SharePoint or the Teams embedding to support first-party embedding. Okay. Now, what you'll see is that the EM SKUs are a lot cheaper in the fact that the EM1 starts at $625. And remember that the EM1 and EM2 are shared. You can't really control them. The other thing is that they're a lot cheaper, so Microsoft forces you to do a year commitment to get the EM SKUs. But once again, for companies that either want to roll their own user interface experience with first-party embedding, or they would like to do the embedding in SharePoint and Teams, which is a no-code approach these days, the EM SKU might be good because you can have more users kind of move from the pro license to the free license. Okay, now, finally, we get to the A SKUs. So A is for Azure, obviously, and it's an entire platform as a service application. So with the A SKUs, you can't use first-party embedding. The only thing you can do is use that master account and have unknown users inside there. So for ISVs, typically it's exactly what they want. It might not be great for organizations because you can't have any user identity. Does that mean I can reach my regular users that have free licenses? Yeah, you can reach them, but you have to reach them as anonymous users, so their identity can't be used to drive something like row-level security. Once again, all we really support is the third-party embedding, in this particular SKU here. Now, here's a decoder ring. So PSKUs, EM SKUs, and A SKUs. Where do you purchase them? PSKUs and EM SKUs you purchase through Office with a subscription, and they require commitments. Azure is, you just saw me create an Azure service. So basically you do it through the Azure portal or one of the other ways to create an Azure service through PowerShell or through some automated coding approach. Okay, can you embed content in custom applications? You can do that with all SKUs. So once again, there's really nothing you can do with an A SKU that you couldn't do with a P or EM SKU as far as reaching users go. However, the A SKU, allows you to stop and start and do that programmatically. So there definitely are things that you can do. But as far as reaching users, if I wanted to reach unknown users and I have a P SKU, there's no reason to get any other SKU. Okay, can you share content with free users outside of PowerBI.com? And note that both P and EM SKUs, the answer is yes. However, when it comes time to share free content or share content with free users inside of PowerBI.com, And so mainly that means that you're using the app model and you've published apps and you want free users to be able to access those. So you're going to need a P SKU, not an EM SKU for that. You can see that billing is monthly with P and EM SKUs, but hourly with A SKUs. Believe me, I'm going to go turn off all my capacities the second this demo is over just to start saving money. You can also see the commitment. The Azure SKU has no commitment. You can start it up, use it for an hour, turn it off, never use it again. Okay. Now, I want to call out a great blog entry by John White. I'll just kind of leave this reference there if you want to go. He's got a nice blog entry to read through about these particular SKUs, and it definitely helped me come up with a more solid explanation. Okay, let's keep going. Next thing we're going to talk about is tenants and organizational accounts. So let's say that I move over here, and I'm going to move back into my Azure tenant, and let's go back into Azure Active Directory. And so in Power BI, everything sits on top of an Azure AD tenant. So for instance, we have a number of users who are living inside here. And so if you're using first-party embedding, who your users are going to be important. If you're using third-party embedding, there's really only one user account that matters. Okay, now I could use my own account. I could also create another account and have that be the master account that's not associated with any human. But remember, you still have to give the master user account a Power BI Pro license because it's going to be accessing content and pulling out the embedding information to serve up. Okay, now Azure AD is going to authenticate our users, and all the users that we're talking about here live in a particular organization or tenant. Okay, but the other important thing is that within that tenant, if I want to access content, my application also has to be registered. So you have to register the applications that you build with Azure AD, and then you get a GUID so that you can identify yourself as you're calling in to authenticate. Okay, so being able to authenticate against Azure AD as a programmer, is a requirement of you calling into the Power BI service. Now, when we register applications, let's go back here, and let's say that we go to Azure Active Directory, and we go to App Registrations, and let's go ahead and create a new one. So what is going to be the name? Ted's Thursday app inside here. And when I create my app, I either create it as a web API or native. Unfortunately, for Power BI third-party embedding, they don't support registering your application as a web app, which unfortunately kind of lowers the security bar for what we're able to secure inside there. Okay, so I'm going to set this as native. And then another unfortunate part about the way we authenticate is that we have to do it with a username and password. And the downside of that is that they're not able to take my redirect URL. And in many applications, the redirect URL is used so that Azure can confirm that your application runs across the internet at that particular URL. However, when we register as native, it doesn't really matter what the redirect URL is going to be. It's not even going to be checked. So you can actually add anything for this inside there. Okay. Now, the things I said that were disparaging about the security model is only for third-party embedding. If you're using first-party embedding, you're not limited to some of the problems that we're going to see. Okay, so there's Ted's Thursday app. Let's go ahead and open it up. What you see is that we have a application ID inside there. Great. Let's go ahead and go back to this application. So what you're going to see is that when you create this application, you have to register it inside there. Okay. Also, a couple other rules that we have to follow is that this application is going to have to get permissions. So note that once I create the application, let's go ahead and add some permissions inside there. And so if I go ahead and say add and select, and so here are the different APIs, and here's the Power BI Service API. So let's go ahead and we'll add that in. Great. And now we'll go ahead and I'm just going to add every single permission. Now, another problem with the way that we have to do third-party embedding is that you have to hard code the username and password into your code, and that is how it's going to authenticate. That actually creates a bit of a rub with Azure Active Directory, because Azure Active Directory doesn't really support unattended execution for user-based logins. And so the first time that a user logs in, Azure wants to interact with the user and confirm that the user will click on a button to accept the permissions that the app has. And so when you do that login with the username and password, it has no opportunity for interaction. And kind of the long and short of it is there's a grant permissions button here that I'm going to click. And if I didn't click that, things would break because I'm trying to do an unattended execution login. And that would not be supported until a user has kind of granted those permissions. And so that's the way to kind of get around that particular problem. Okay, now note that with other Azure applications, you might be creating things like keys. But once again, this is kind of a, the no frills style of authentication that you have to use when you have a master user account and you want to do embedding with it. Okay, now what you're going to see here is that you go through, you create a native application. It's got a application ID, and then we go through and we set properties. I would recommend that you use the Azure portal like I'm doing. Note that the Power BI team about a year and a half, 2 years back, created a page at app.powerbi.com/apps or also at dev.powerbi.com/apps. And they go to a page, they allow you to register, and behind the scenes, they'll basically do the registration in Azure, but you'll just have a lot more control if you go to the Azure portal directly because you'll be able to change any of the permissions inside there. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to add those particular permissions inside there. Note that in the permission model of the Power BI Service API, we only support delegated permissions which are associated with a particular user. So just because of the way they've architected the Power BI service, there is no support for application permissions. So you can't authenticate as an application. It always has to be as a user. Okay. And then I went through kind of the requirement for clicking the grant permissions, so we can basically grant the permissions that the application is asking for. Now, without going into too much detail on authentication flows, there are 4 common authentication flows that we use when we authenticate our own custom application against Azure. So the very top one, client credential flow, is when you want your application to authenticate, not a user. Okay, that's not supported in Power BI. Now, the 2 next ones, authorization code grant flow and implicit grant flow, are very important, and they're how we authenticate a particular user when we're not just passing a username and password, but the user can interact and actually type the login inside there. So when you do first-party embedding, you're going to be able to use authorization code grant flow or implicit grant flow. Unfortunately, with third-party embedding, you have to use user credentials flow. And I say unfortunate because the messaging, from the identity team in Microsoft that creates Azure Active Directory is that user credentials flow is only there for legacy applications, but unfortunately, it's what we use. And we'll see some examples, of why it could be better in just a second. But let me just kind of finish with this. If you're using first-party embedding, you can either use the authentication code grant flow or implicit flow. When you're using third-party embedding, you have to use direct user credentials flow. You can also see that with first-party embedding, it's the current user whose identity and permissions we're using. With third-party embedding, it's the master user account. Okay, note that with first-party embedding, you can access a personal workspace, and it's the personal workspace of the current user. So there's no access to personal workspaces with third-party embedding. Okay. can you access a app workspace? And the answer is yes, with first-party embedding, if that user has a pro license and has been given permissions to that app workspace. And then we're going to assume that that's what we're always doing with third-party embedding. Ability to reach non-licensed users, is why we use third-party embedding. Okay, and so note that for first-party embedding, you can't use the A SKUs. You can only use the P and EM SKUs. So with third-party embedding, you can use any of the 3 SKUs inside there. Okay, now, in just a second, I'm going to start stepping through the code in this sample application. And what you're going to see is that we require a couple different things. We require that client ID. Also, we require the app workspace. For instance, if I go to a particular workspace, like customer A right here, up here in the URL, what you'll see is a particular GUID. So in our application, what you're going to see is that I can take that GUID and I can put that inside there. Okay, and then also, you can see that with this style of application, you're going to have to hard code the name of that master user account. And this account, has to have a Power BI Pro license to be able to succeed at this. Also note that here I've hard coded the password in because it's demo code. But what Microsoft is going to recommend is that you use something like the Azure Vault, to basically store secrets in the cloud so you can pull them in safely into your application. Okay, so now you've seen that. Let's talk a little bit more about the Active Directory Authentication Library. So there is a method, or there is a particular class, which is the user password credential. So this is a very simple flow because all you have to do is create an authentication context, create a user password credential with the username and password, and then say acquire access token. Okay. It's just there's a lot of downside to using this because it's a lot less secure than other approaches that the Power BI team could have used. Okay, so now I'll stop lamenting on the downside of direct user authentication, and let's look at a example of using the Power BI Service API. So I'm going to go ahead and move over. There's one other application that I'm going to look at in addition to the Daily Reporter Pro, and that one is called Clone Power BI Workspace. Let's go ahead and open this up inside here. Now here, I basically just got a native app, and I'm just going to go ahead and connect inside here. But let's kind of see a simple example. So let's say that I want to just look at the assets, inside of my personal workspace. So with this application here, note that I have some code right here, and inside of this particular code, I basically hard coded things like my username and password inside there. And so now I want to get this thing which is called the Power BI client. Now, when you use the .NET wrapper around the Power BI REST API, you create a Power BI client object, you pass the URL to the root, and then you also have to get a token. So here's an example of creating a token credential. I've got something that's getting the access token, but now the Power BI client allows me to, create a token credential. And note that the token credential comes from, it's not supplied by the Power BI Service API. If I go up here and I kind of look at the installed packages inside of this project, when this guy finally comes back, come on. What you're going to see here is that when you include the Power BI SDK, it automatically includes the Microsoft.REST client runtime. And so basically that's the thing that defines the token credentials. But the idea is if you get the access token and then you basically wrap a token credential, now it can create a Power BI client. Okay, now in this first example right here, here Notice that with the Power BI client, I can say datasets, got datasets.value. Let's go ahead and open up this sample, which is Fiddler. Let's go ahead and run this application right here. So what we should see here is that, as I run this and I'm making these calls, you can see that eventually my application now kind of gets the access token it needs, and now it's calling in to get a set of reports. So if I make this a little bit bigger here and we kind of take a look at, what's coming back, I call into data sets, there are the data sets. There are the reports, there are the dashboards. Okay, so either in my personal workspace or in an app workspace, I can go through and look at different assets inside here. Okay, now, if you've played around with the REST API before, you'll note that at some cases, you can use the .NET wrapper. For instance, let's go down here, and I've been doing work about publishing PBX files. And so if you had to use the raw REST API, that was really gnarly. Look at what we can now do. Power BI client, create a file stream, Power BI imports, post-import with file. So when you use the REST API directly, that was about 30 gnarly lines of code. Now it's real simple. Okay, how about patching data source credentials? So let's say that after I upload a PBX file, I want to go to a data source inside there, and I want to update the username and password that we use. That's still not supported by the .NET wrapper. So for that code, I'm still just making direct REST API calls inside here. Okay, now what I want to show in this demo is something that's new that Microsoft just added. So they allow you to export PBIX files. And so they also give us this approach for basically moving assets from one workspace to another. So here's the scenario. Let's say that I'm going to be creating a lot of workspaces, one for each new customer that I want to target with a Power BI report. So I'm going to create this workspace template. So inside of my workspace template, let's say that we have a couple different data sets and a couple different reports inside here. Okay. So now let's say that every time I create a new customer, we have the exact same set of stuff. It's just the data sets point to a different SQL database that I have. So I want to kind of have a quick way to populate these. Okay. So let's say that I go back here and I'm going to run a piece of code, and it's going to be this clone app workspace. So what I want to do is I want to go down and I want to find the workspace template. And maybe before I do that one, let's do kind of a create workspace. So we'll come down here and I say create workspace. And when I say create workspace, we'll call this one something such as customer B inside here. Okay. Now, with create app workspace, what we can see here is that the API gives me a group creation request, and I can basically create something new inside there. And maybe I want to make an admin, and I want to make an admin out of my PBE master user, and we have SharePoint confessions. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this right here. So what I want to show here is, programmatically, if I want to create a new app workspace on the fly, let's go ahead and I'm just going to refresh the page so I repopulate the different workspaces that are there. So if I pull this down, hey, we've just created customer B. Let's go ahead and edit the workspace. Also note that I have added the code to automatically add the master user account as admin inside there. Okay. So, once again, I want to just kind of hand you some code. Here's some code to create an app workspace. Let's go a little further. Let's go ahead and use this, which is going to clone an app workspace. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to take all the reports and all the data sets that are in that app workspace template, and I want to push them over into this other place. So I'm not going to step through all the code, but we basically pass the source workspace name and the target workspace name. If the target's not created, we create it on the fly. But now what you're going to see here is, let me go ahead and run this. And as I run this, I'm going to go down into my temp file right here. And what you're going to see is that we have some code that goes to the source, and it's able to take every report, and there's a new export call, and you can basically download the PBX file. So what this code is doing is it's downloading the PBX file from the report in the source workspace, and then basically publishing it or posting it to the other workspace inside there. And so, when we're all done inside here, let's go over and kind of take a look at what we've done. And we're able to, add these 3 new data sets and 3 reports, just copying the content. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't do anything with dashboards, but this does give you an effective way to, copy a set of resources from one place to another. And note that the code here is really proof of concept. This code is not bulletproof, because you could have 3 different reports off a single data set. So we're not dealing with a lot of contingencies, but just kind of showing you a proof of concept how you can get started, in basically cloning what's inside of an app workspace. Okay, now I should basically, now that we've created this new app workspace right here, I should be able to do a couple things. One is I should be able to get its GUID. 2, note that if I go to Workspace B, the API doesn't yet give me a way to put it, inside of a dedicated capacity. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that myself. We'll go ahead and click on Save right here. And so now we got the diamond, and we know we're in this dedicated capacity right here. If we go back to our other application, let's go back here to Daily Reporter Pro, and note that I've just kind of changed this to point to this app workspace inside here. Okay, so let me go ahead and fire this up just to kind of make sure that I can get to content, inside of the new app workspace that we've just created inside here. And after this connects right here, give it a couple more seconds, and something is not working correct inside there. Okay, I'm not exactly sure what I've done wrong inside there. Okay. It's just a demo. I'm going to go ahead and move on, but just kind of wanted to show you how easy it was to kind of move over and create a new workspace. And there's not going to be many dependencies in your application, other than the master user account, name and password, the client ID of your application, and the GUID of your application workspace. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and move on, kind of talk a little bit more about this application. So if you want to dissect this Daily Reporter Pro application, what you're going to see, it's an MVC app. So it has server-side code running in which my C# code running on the server can interact with Azure AD and get back access tokens. It can then also make calls into the Power BI service. Now, if you look at the first page that we can go to, for instance, let's go back here, and I'll just kind of go to my deployed version of this in subliminalsystems.com. Subliminalsystems.com is a great domain name. Now, note that right here, what we're able to do is we're able to build our own custom view models. And then we're able to pass data. For instance, I have a home view model. And when we pass data inside there, we can do things like pull out the view model information. And for instance, when I create a view model, I'm just basically deciding what data I want to move from the server out to the client. So I want to get things like the workspace name, the ID, the master user account. That's how I'm able to, show this type of information on that page right there. Okay. And then here's an example of using the Power BI client. And I can say client.groups, get groups async. And once I figure out, what workspace I'm in, and I'm going to match that up by the name. And once I find a workspace of the same name, I got the ID. Now I can go ahead and pass that out. Okay, now what you'll see is that we have several different pages that we can use inside there. And we're going to pass out information about Power BI embedding. So for instance, when I go here, into the reports page, we basically did a query so we can figure out, what are the different reports. When someone clicks on one of these, note that here's where we're going to load the report. And so the way I built the application is when you click on that, it adds a query string report ID equals, and that kind of triggers the whole process of adding in the particular iframe. Now let's focus on what data do you need to get from the Power BI service that gets passed into the browser. So the first embeddable resource, is a report. And reports have the best story because reports are fully interactive. So things like highlighting work just fine inside there, as do slicers. You're able to show them the navigation or take it away. So if you want to show them, the navigation pane, and once again, these are, fully interactive. Now, another neat aspect is that you can also open things up in edit mode. So here you're on a custom application, and now you've kind of given the user, the ability to, open something up right here, and the user, might decide that, a particular color is not right for them inside there. So being able to go here and, make some type of a change, and then be able to come back, and save the report. I have one little permission thing I need to switch in there for that to work correctly. And we'll see that in just a second. But you can see that the ability to kind of take the user, in and out of edit mode and have it be white labeled so the user has, no idea that this is Power BI. They just think it's the functionality of your custom application, gets to be pretty neat. Okay. Also note with reports, you can create new reports. So the API, I'm going to go ahead and click new here. So if you want the user to be able to create a new report, what you need to do is present the user with an option of data sets, or your code needs to pick a data set. So when you create a new report, you pick a data set, not a report. So for instance, let's say the user, creates this new report right here. So now a user is able to create this particular report. Let's go ahead and add something inside there, such as year and sales revenue inside here. And once this report, has been created inside here, let's go ahead and add that inside. This report, can be saved. Let's do a save as. We'll save this one, as report 1 inside here. Once again, realize this is just a customer of mine that has no Power BI license, never used Power BI, yet my application is allowing them to edit the reports I've given them or to create new reports themselves. And note, while my customer is using this, let's go behind the scenes. Someone who works for my company, can go back inside here, can go and, find that particular report and can open up the report just using the Power BI experience. And, let's say that we decide, yeah, that's not very good. We want to switch that back to a stacked bar chart. Let's go ahead and close and save. And now we'll go back, to the customer view of what we're using inside here. And let's go ahead and open up that report one more time. So what you can see is it's very easy for, the customers to edit reports if you want to give them those permissions. But also it's easy for people on your own staff, to add and edit reports manually and still make them accessible to people who are using Power BI embedding. So the app workspace is the thing that you build out with what you want to show to the user. Okay. And let's keep going through here. I want to get to a little bit more. We also have dashboards. So you are able to embed a dashboard, and as I get to a particular dashboard right here, and I guess I now realize in customer A we have no dashboards. So if I go to this sales report and open that up, and let's quickly create a new dashboard. And now I'll go ahead and embed these two inside there. So now I have a wonderful dashboard here. Let me go ahead and kind of switch it around a little bit. And okay, not great, but you kind of get the idea. Let's now kind of go back here, and now let's refresh this client application, and there's dashboard 1. And so I can go ahead and embed that dashboard inside there. When you embed a dashboard, you're not going to get any interactivity inside there. Okay, I think it's just taking a second for the map to come inside there. You'll get interactivity in the fact that you'll see tooltips, but you can't click on a tile and do something like move like you would inside the Power BI service. Okay, and then finally note that in addition to embedding reports and dashboards, they also have allowed you to embed individual dashboard tiles. So if you don't want the whole dashboard, I just want to take pieces of it. And then they're currently also in the process of enabling us to embed individual visuals from a report as opposed to the whole report inside there. So at the beginning of next year, that should be a possibility as well. Now, the data that you pull back from the Power BI service that you then have to pass to the client, it's going to be things like the ID of the report and the embed URL. So you can see information here is the embed URL, here is the ID. Okay, if you're getting information about a data set because you want to create a new report, well, then you need things like the ID of that inside there. Okay, now another thing we have to worry about is getting embed tokens. And remember, when you're using third-party embedding, what you don't want to do is you don't want to embed reports with the Active Directory user token for the master user, because that's going to be really powerful. So what we do instead is we generate tokens, embed tokens, using the API. As a for instance, let's go ahead and move back to this application code. Under models, I have a PBI embedded manager inside here. And so let's say I want to get information, for reports. And the idea here is that someone's going to come to a particular page, such as reports. And note that when you go to reports, there might not be any query string parameter. And if that's the case, we're just going to show the reports. However, if we get a query string parameter that has either the report ID or the dataset ID, if I see a query string parameter with the report ID, I know to open and load an existing report. If I see a query string parameter that says dataset ID, I know to create a new report based on that particular dataset. Now, in our case right here, we're going to generate one of these tokens. The reason that I could not edit that before is because when I generated the token, it was a view token. Let's go ahead and switch that to a edit token. And let's go ahead and run this one more time. And what we should see here, and now I realize that this is the thing that I broke, so I don't think this is going to work for us inside there. But the idea that when you create the token, that you're able to specify what level that you have inside there, and allow save. Okay. Now, once you call this in and you get the particular token, you have a generate token in groups async that you're able to call inside there. Okay. And also, I'm not doing it here, but when you generate the token, if you want to use row level security, you basically need to pass the name of one or more roles when you create the token, and the token comes back with those roles inside there. Okay, so row level security works fine. It's just that your application has to authenticate the users. Power BI knows nothing about your users. And once you authenticate your user, you have to have some way that you've associated one or more roles with those users. And you can basically find those roles and pass them in your call when you generate the embed token inside there. Okay. Now, what I'd like to kind of spend the last bit of time on here is working with the client-side JavaScript API. And so what I want to show inside here is going to be inside the app folder. Let's go into app.ts. I'm going to do a couple more slides too as well. So we've looked at embed tokens, and now we want to kind of focus on the Power BI JavaScript API. Now, before I jump into my code, I also kind of wanted to point out that if you go to this URL right here, and at this particular URL, sorry, I'm jumping around here. Okay, so let me go inside of a browser and go to this location right here. And so what I want to show you is that the Power BI JavaScript API, is maintained in a GitHub repository, just like the .NET version of the API is. And they have a wiki section, and I find this a very helpful place to go through. And I find that, as they add new things in, for instance, they've just added menu command extensions, and they added to the wiki page, how to go through and set those inside there. Okay, now let's look at a couple different things that I can do with the JavaScript API. So the first thing to see is that the way I've set things up is that I have a report index view that basically takes the information that we need, which is basically the embed configuration information and the embed URL and the embed token, and it basically passes them into index CHTML. But then we call methods that are inside of a TypeScript file named app.ts. So what you're going to see, is that app.ts has all the code. Now, when I want to do a basic embedding, what I need to do is I need to create this special configuration object that has things like, what is the type? Is it a report or a dashboard? What is the GUID of that object? What is the embed URL? What is the access token? And the access token could be an Azure access token, or it could be an embed token. So then in the next argument, you have to basically tell it whether it's an Azure AD token that you would use in first-party embedding, or is it an embed token that you're going to always use with third-party embedding. Okay. Then you have things like, what are your permissions when you embed a report? I'm going to give this user, all permissions. Note that you can give all permissions here, but if your embed token has view, not edit, you can't save. Okay. Also, what's the view mode? Do you want to open up in view or edit mode? You probably want to open in view mode. And then you have things like fit to width, versus actual size inside there. Okay. Now, just to look at a couple more things inside, let me go back to our application. And let's go to a report. And so one of the things that you're going to see is that when a report loads in, you've basically got events that the iframe is triggering in your JavaScript code. Okay, as a for instance, if I move back, into this code, and what happens when I want to embed a report? So I embed a report, Power BI embed, there is that configuration object, and then I also have to pass in the HTML element I'm embedding inside. But now once I have that report object, I can say report on, and I can say that after it takes the 5 seconds to load the report, go ahead and call back into my JavaScript code on the page, so I can do things like discover what pages are inside the report. So one of the things that I'm doing here is when the report finally loads in and triggers that event, I can go and figure out what pages we have. Now, while it's possible for you to kind of show the navigation down below, you might find in large reports, you're better off just kind of turning off the navigation and then kind of creating your own navigation system, using JavaScript or TypeScript on the page inside there. You'll also see that the Eventing API, makes it so that if the user was going through the report and clicking these tabs, I can still keep, my navigation in sync. Okay. What are some of the other things? You've seen I can kind of move into edit mode and out of edit mode. And the way that we're doing that is, let me just kind of move down a little bit further. And when someone is clicking on edit mode, I can simply say report update settings. And something about edit mode, where when you go into edit mode, you want to make sure the filter pane is enabled. Okay, so notice that there's report switch mode, and there's edit and view. So you can see here that, as I go back and forth between those two different modes, it's very easy. You're just calling a simple JavaScript method, on this report object, which is the wrapper around what's inside of the iframe. Okay, how about I want to set a filter? So here's some code to set a state filter. So here, I want to have a basic filter. Once again, the wiki will kind of step through how to build this, but here is my target. Go to the customers table, find the state column, and make it so that the values have to be, inside here. Okay, over here, we'll set the filter, and we'll be better off here if we're looking at this page. And now we'll remove the filter and set the filter. So it's just able to set a filter at the report level. Note that you can also set filters at the visual level, with this API. Okay, we also have things like full screen mode, that the user can go into. And once again, it's all easy to control, with this JavaScript API. Okay, now I realize I've kind of gone a little bit over. I get excited about this kind of stuff, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this video. I'm going to make sure that it gets posted to YouTube. And if any of you are, working through the code samples and have any questions, please go ahead and forward questions on to me. I'll do my best to respond to them. Let me just kind of close out by saying, if you enjoyed this type of training and you want some, drill down at Critical Path Training, we have both a Power BI for non-developer and Power BI for developer. They're both pretty technical courses. The developer bootcamp course, we've just added coverage of the custom connectors and programming in M. Pretty exciting stuff. But we have a pretty in-depth coverage of what we kind of feel is all the important developer surface area in the Power BI platform. So with that, we're going to go ahead and end our session. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming and spending a little bit of time with me here. We will send a follow-up message to everybody, with the recording. And other than that, hope everyone has a great holiday and look forward to seeing everyone early next year. Take care. Thank you very much.